Let me take you back to the distant past of 1970s Britain.
Hey, wasn't that the era with all those bright colours everywhere? No, go back!
Back then, life was simple. There was no smartphones, no social media, just you, the great outdoors, and some horrendous fashion, good lord that is ugly. This was a time of rights. Workers' rights, more specifically, thanks to the huge power of the trade unions. Companies quaked in fear at the sight of these trade unions, being forced to improve working conditions and issue pay rises, or risk strikes. Companies such as British Telecommunications and British Railway were also publicly owned by the government, which allowed them access to a large funding pool as well as additional support from the government. This was great as it meant issues could be fixed quickly and major expansions could be possible. But imagine a world where this wasn't the case. Workers had little rights, companies were privately owned, and fashion was somehow normal. Well, you're in luck. Because here comes the 1980s. Elected in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister for the entirety of the 1980s, bringing a lot of changes to British culture. To start with, she heavily weakened the trade unions, making millions of workers lose their rights overnight. That turned out just great. She also decided to sell a bunch of government-owned services, turning the previously mentioned BT and British Rail into private companies. She justified this by saying that it would make the companies more efficient, since they now have to be competitive with one another. That didn't work. She also decided to take away the kiddies' free milk, which is... why? Over the next 5 or so years, things began to turn sour. Over 3 million people were unemployed by 1983, mainly as a result of Thatcher's changes. The manufacturing industry had a major decline of over 25%, and many coal mines were forced to close, leaving 20,000 people without work. This chain of events is directly referred to as Thatcherism. Nowhere was hit harder than Liverpool, a city situated in the northwest of England, right about here. Thanks to being fairly geographically isolated from other areas of the UK and being a major manufacturing centre, Liverpool really struggled, and its main source of revenue, the ports, essentially collapsed overnight. Now, how am I going to segue this into social class? I don't know, let's just go. Back in the 1980s, social class was far more defined than what it is now, the main divide being between middle and working. While working classes tended to be heavily affected by Thatcherism, middle classes, for the most part, got off scot-free. There are a bunch of key differences between the two, but the most notable include the difference in housing quality, stereotypes related to marriage and children, and the most notable, schooling, which basically restricted you to one line of work depending on which class you were. Margaret Thatcher had this idea that if you wanted to get somewhere, you were the only one that could make that happen, which is respectable, honestly. I mean, she is the living embodiment of that, the first female Prime Minister of the UK, and she lasted over 11 years. For some reason, a few years later, she also stated that nobody would remember the Good Samaritan if he only had good intentions. He had money as well. A bit contradictory, but I'll take it.